Caleb Whitfield stood on the platform of the Miller's Gulch Depot on a sunlit morning in April 1885. In his hand, a fistful of prairie asters was already starting to wilt, and he did not know it yet. But he was about to meet a woman who was not the one he'd been expecting. He had picked those flowers himself at first light out past the barn because a letter had told him Eleanor Vance, his mail-order bride, loved wild asters above any other flower. He was wearing his one good coat. He had practiced her name the whole ride into town, Eleanor Vance, until it stopped sounding like a stranger's name and started sounding like something that belonged to him. The train came in loud and slow, hissing. Steam rolled across the platform, and Caleb watched every window the way a man watches weather coming in. A woman stepped down. She was not dressed for a wedding. She wore a canvas riding skirt slit for the saddle, faded pale at the knees, a man's wool coat 2 sizes too big, and gloves worn through at the first knuckle. A coiled lariat hung off the strap of her travel bag, the way another woman might carry a parasol. She had the look of someone who'd ridden more miles than she'd ever walked in her whole life. Caleb stepped forward anyway, flowers first, Hope doing most of the talking for him. "Miss Vance," he said, clearing his throat. The woman stopped him with a raised hand before he got any closer. The kind of gesture you'd use to stop a runaway calf. "You bought the wrong bride," she said. 4 words strong enough to fold flowers. Caleb Whitfield stood there on the platform of his own town in front of half the people he'd grown up with, holding a handful of wildflowers in honor of a woman who apparently no longer existed. And here's the part nobody in Miller's Gulch expected. Least of all the woman standing in front of him. He smiled. He lowered the flowers and put his hand out to shake. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, whoever you are," he said, "because you came a long way to deliver bad news to a stranger in person, and that's not nothing. Anyone who's read the frontier papers of that decade knows most men, told that on a train platform, would have stormed off in a fury." Caleb Whitfield put his hand out instead. To understand why, you need to know what he already knew standing on that platform and what he did not yet know about the woman in front of him. Both matter. Stay for both. Her name was Hallie Rourke, and she had not come to marry anyone. 3 days earlier, Hallie Rourke had been minding her own business entirely, which was cattle, not correspondence. She was 26, out of Wyoming territory, and had spent the last 6 years driving stock north along the rail lines for her father's outfit, work that suited her better than any parlor ever had. That week, she was escorting 40, head to a buyer outside Miller's Gulch, riding the same eastbound train 2 cars up from a connection in Cheyenne, minding 40 head of cattle and her own ledger and nobody else's romance. Eleanor Vance was minding a great deal of romance, all of it going badly. Eleanor had answered Caleb Whitfield's matrimonial notice 6 months before from a parlor back east in Hartford. Charmed by a description of open sky and good grazing that she'd pictured wrongly as something closer to a large park. She had corresponded pleasantly through the winter. She had packed a trunk of dresses unsuited to any task a ranch would ever ask of her. And somewhere past Cheyenne, watching the trees thin out and the land go flat and enormous, and utterly without a single familiar landmark in any direction, Eleanor Vance had come to understand, all at once and completely, that she had made a catastrophic mistake. She would not get off the train. She sat rigid in her seat as it slowed into Miller's Gulch, staring straight ahead, while the conductor pleaded, and her trunk sat useless on the platform. She was not, by her own tearful account afterward to anyone who'd listen, brave enough to face the man she'd written 100 letters to and simply tell him no in person. What she was brave enough to do was grab the sleeve of the nearest capable-looking woman in the car, who happened to be Hallie Rourke, coming back from checking on her cattle in the stock car, and beg her, with real desperation, to carry a folded letter out to whoever was waiting and explain because she, Eleanor, could not bear to see his face when he heard it. Hallie Rourke had exactly no reason in the world to say yes to this. She had cattle to sell, a train to catch onward, and no acquaintance whatsoever with the disappointed rancher of Miller's Gulch. She said yes anyway for a reason she couldn't entirely explain to herself later, beyond the plain fact that somebody had to do it, and that somebody standing in the doorway happened to be her. She meant to hand over the letter and be gone in 2 minutes. That is not, in the end, how the 2 minutes went. "There's a letter," Hallie said, as soon as his hand came down from the shake he'd offered. Neither of them let that moment pass without another word. She held it out. "She asked me to give you this instead of saying it herself. I've had plenty of time to think it over on the ride, so I'll save you the long version if you'd rather hear it plain instead of dressed up fancy." "Plain," Caleb said. "She's not coming." She got a good long look at Wyoming territory out the train window and decided it was a bad place to live. She saw a lot more of it than she meant to. She's sorry, and she means it. I don't think she's a bad person. She's just the wrong person for this particular stretch of ground, and she figured that out about 400 miles too late to say so any other way. She said it kindly in a letter, so I'm saying it kindly for her." Caleb looked down at the sealed letter in his hand for a long moment, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite sorrow, wasn't quite relief, and ended up settling somewhere honest between the two. "I'm obliged to you," he said finally. "Minding your own cattle and handling a stranger's heartbreak in the same week seems like a poor trade for you." "Wasn't much of a trade," Hallie allowed. "Wasn't going to let a man walk up onto a platform with flowers and find out the hard way either. Some things a person ought to hear from somebody, even if it's the wrong somebody saying it." She turned to go. A buyer was waiting on her, and 40 head of cattle costing her money by the hour stood idle in the pens while she ran this errand. "Miss Rourke," Caleb said, before she'd gone, which kept her on that platform longer than either of them planned. "Before you go, I don't suppose you know any rancher hereabouts who could use an extra hand for 30 days? I find myself in considerably deeper trouble than a missing bride, and it happens to be the kind of trouble where someone who rides better than she talks could be genuinely useful." Hallie Rourke looked at him carefully for the first time, past the flowers and the coat and the plain disappointment still settling on his shoulders. Something in the shape of the question caught her interest, the way an odd brand catches a cattlewoman's eye. 30 days for what? "For keeping hold of a ranch that won't be mine unless I'm married by the time I turn 30, Caleb said, "which is May the 23rd, 29 days from this morning." The trouble, once Caleb got to explaining it, was that he explained all of it. Coffee at the Miller's Gulch Hotel had nothing romantic about it. It was just paper, and paper is usually the worst kind of enemy. His father, Thaddeus Whitfield, had built the anchor spread on 11,000 acres of good grass and 20 years of stubbornness, and had passed the autumn before, leaving a will that every lawyer who'd read it agreed was written by a proud man determined to control his son, even from the grave. The will said the whole estate would pass to Caleb, provided Caleb was married and keeping a household by his 30th birthday. Should that condition go unmet, the ranch would pass in equal shares to his cousin, Silas Whitfield, a man who'd never in his life helped a calf into the world or mended a fence, but who'd spent the last 6 months in quiet, frequent correspondence with an agent of the Union Pacific Railroad. My father figured a wife would settle me down, Caleb said, but truth is, I think he was afraid of exactly what's happening now. Silas wants to sell his half the day this deadline runs out to the railroad, the cattle syndicate, whoever pays first. And once the money's out, it takes half the anchor with it, all of it gone. Everything my father spent his life building inside of 2 years. I've watched it happen to 3 outfits in this county already. I don't intend to make it a 4th. So you advertised for a wife, Hallie said, the way a man orders seed corn out of a catalogue. Not proud of the method, Caleb admitted. I am, however, 29 days from losing the one thing my father ever built, and pride's a luxury I'm short on this particular spring. Hallie sat with that. Her coffee was going cold, and she was turning the whole shape of it over in her mind, the way you look over a horse before you buy him. You're asking a stranger you met 40 minutes ago to marry you. I'm asking a stranger I met 40 minutes ago to help me hold on to a ranch, Caleb said. Whatever gets worked out on paper or otherwise is a conversation for later, and only if you're willing to have it. I was engaged 6 months to a woman I never once laid eyes on, and it came to nothing. I'm not fool enough to think a marriage fixes anything that isn't already true underneath. But I've got 29 days and a lawyer who's a decent man doing indecent work on my cousin's behalf, and I'd rather spend those days working alongside somebody honest than waiting on somebody who's already told me, by way of a stranger and a folded letter, that she doesn't want this life. It was, Hallie thought, possibly the strangest proposal ever made. They talked over lukewarm coffee at the hotel, and in a somewhat uncomfortable way, it turned out to be one of the most honest conversations she'd ever had with a man in her life. I've got a buyer waiting on 40 head, she said. I can give you 2 days while I settle that business. After that, I've got to account to my father's outfit, and they're not expecting me to marry a Wyoming rancher on my way home from a cattle sale. 2 days is a start, Caleb said. I've learned to work fast this spring. Whatever Hallie Rourke had pictured of the anchor spread, something threadbare and desperate, to match a man reduced to mail-order matrimony, the reality surprised her. The house was in good repair, the fences tight, the herd fat on the good spring grass, and the hands, 4 of them, all older men who'd ridden for Thaddeus Whitfield a decade or more, watched. Hallie's arrival was met with the particular caution of men waiting to see if a newcomer could actually work before deciding whether to like her. She settled that question by sundown of the first day, roping a lame cow stuck fast in a bog on the second try, and setting the leg herself, better than the ranch's own foreman would have managed. By supper, all 4 hands had stopped calling her Miss, careful and polite, and started calling her Boss, the way you say it for somebody who's earned it. Caleb watched all of this with an expression Hallie caught twice and couldn't quite place. Not quite surprise. Something closer to recognition. The way you look at a tune you can't name but know you've heard before. The 2 days stretched, honestly and without much ceremony on either side, into 4, then into a week. There was real work to be done, and Hallie found herself doing it, culling, branding, riding fence, with a competence that made the 30-day arrangement feel less like charity and more like a partnership neither one of them had quite named out loud yet. Evenings they sat on the porch with the lawyer's letters, the will's exact wording spread out between them, working it over like 2 people solving a puzzle, rather than 2 people falling into anything. Silas Whitfield rode out on the 9th day to see for himself what his cousin was up to, and didn't bother hiding his displeasure at finding a competent stranger running cattle instead of a heartbroken bachelor running out the clock. "Word in town is your bride never showed," Silas said. Not bothering to dismount, looking Hallie over the way a man sizes up a horse, he means to disqualify on a technicality. And that whoever this is, she's some drover's daughter, picked up off a train platform for the occasion. A judge is going to want to know this marriage is genuine, cousin. I'll be making sure he asks. "Ask away," Hallie said, before Caleb could answer, in a voice that had settled 40 head of nervous cattle onto a rail car without once raising itself. "I've branded more of this outfit's calves in 9 days than you've branded in your life, Mr. Whitfield. You go right ahead and tell your judge a woman who can rope, doctor, and keep books isn't a real wife, on account of she arrived on a stock train instead of a passenger coach. I expect he'll have opinions of his own on which one of us understands what a ranch marriage actually is." Silas Whitfield had no ready answer for that, and rode off considerably less certain of his railroad money than he'd arrived. Caleb watched her a long moment after the dust settled. "You didn't have to fight that battle," he said. "It's mine to fight," Hallie said. "It's ours to fight," Hallie said, and then heard what she'd said and didn't take it back. "If I'm staying past 30 days, which I find I'm starting to consider." It was the first time either of them had said the word out loud, and neither one made a show of it, and both of them noticed anyway. A letter caught up to Hallie on the 12th day, forwarded from the buyer's office in Miller's Gulch, and it was not the kind of letter that made staying any simpler. It was from her father. He was glad to hear the cattle had sold well. He mentioned, in the same unhurried hand he used for everything from branding schedules to bad news, that Dean Coburn had come by the house twice that month asking after her, that Dean ran a sound outfit 2 counties over, and that a man who asks after a woman twice in 1 month while she's 400 miles from home is a man worth a serious answer, one way or the other. Her father didn't tell her what to do. He never had. He simply laid the facts on the table the way he laid out a saddle before a long ride, and let her decide what she was riding into. Hallie read the letter twice on the porch steps, then a third time, and Caleb, coming out to check the evening stock, saw her face and had the good sense not to ask. She wrote back that night by lamplight, tearing up 2 drafts before letting the third one stand. She told her father the truth because lying to him had never once worked in 26 years, and she saw no reason to start now. She told him about the wrong bride, the 30 days, a rancher who'd offered her honest work instead of a honeyed promise, and a ranch that felt, God help her, more like something worth fighting for with every day that passed. She told him Dean Coburn was a good man, and she was in no position to promise him anything, because she didn't currently know what she was promising herself. What she wrote near the bottom of the page was this: "You always said a person ought to choose the harder, true thing over the easier, maybe. I don't know yet if this is the true thing. I know it isn't the easy one. And for once in my life, that isn't scaring me off it." Her father's answer came back 3 weeks later, short, as always. He told Dean Coburn kindly that his daughter's heart appeared to be otherwise occupied, and Dean, being a decent sort, wished her well and married a schoolteacher friend of a Coburn cousin within the year, which everyone agreed suited him better in the end, but that answer came later. In the meantime, Hallie folded her own letter and sat with the not knowing, which was its own kind of work, harder in some ways than any calf she'd ever pulled. Silas didn't ride out again. He went to the county seat instead, which was worse. He filed a petition before Judge Amos Hargrove, a circuit judge brought in special from Casper, asking that any marriage completed in the final days before the deadline be examined for what he called, in careful lawyer's language, want of genuine intent. He had witnesses lined up, the station master, who'd testify the expected bride had never arrived, the hotel clerk, who'd testify an entirely different woman had checked into a room that same afternoon. It was not an unreasonable petition dressed up as it was in reasonable words, and that was exactly what made it dangerous. "He's not wrong about the facts," Caleb said, reading the filing at the kitchen table with a grimness Hallie hadn't seen on him before. "He's just wrong about what the facts mean. A judge who doesn't know either one of us is going to read this and see exactly what Silas wants him to see. A rancher panicked by a deadline, a woman paid off a passing train." "Nobody's paying me anything," Hallie said. "I know that. You know that. A stranger reading a filing at a desk in Casper doesn't know that." Caleb rubbed his eyes. Hearings set for the 21st, 2 days before the deadline. If Hargrove rules the marriage was arranged in bad faith, the whole condition fails whether we're married by the 23rd or not. Silas gets his half free and clear. "Then we'd better give the judge something realer to look at than a filing full of facts arranged sideways," she said finally. "Facts arranged honest usually beat facts arranged clever. I've seen it happen at cattle auctions more times than I can count." She didn't say, because she hadn't fully admitted it to herself yet, that the facts had stopped feeling arranged at all somewhere around the 9th day and had started feeling simply true. To understand what happened next, you have to go back 3 winters to a storm neither of them, until that week, knew they'd shared. In the winter of 1882, Caleb Whitfield had ridden with his father's outfit on a late drive north along the Bozeman Trail, pushing 800 head against advice and against weather that had no business turning as fast as it did. The storm came down off the plains with almost no warning, a wall of white that swallowed the sun in the space of 20 minutes. Caleb, chasing a break in the herd, got separated from the outfit and was thrown when his horse went down in a drift he never saw coming. He lay in the snow long enough to stop feeling his hands, which every man on that trail knew was the last stop before stopping feeling everything else. What saved him was a stranger, a young cowgirl riding drag on a different outfit's herd a mile east, who saw a riderless horse circling and went looking on, nothing but instinct and stubbornness. She found him half buried, cut a fire out of buffalo chips and sage with hands as cold as his, wrapped him in her own coat and blanket, and sat up through the worst of the night, keeping him talking so he wouldn't slip under. By the grey hour before dawn, with the wind dropping, she'd gotten him onto her own horse, walked him 3 miles to a line shack, built a second fire, and left before full light, without ever giving her name, because she had 800 head of somebody else's cattle scattered across a blizzard and a job to finish. Caleb Whitfield had spent 3 years trying to describe that night to people who hadn't lived it, and always failing. He remembered the coat most of all, an old canvas thing, too big for her, mended at one shoulder with a line of unmistakable red thread stitched in a pattern like small running birds. He remembered a voice that never once let fear into it, even when his own had started to. He didn't remember a face clearly. The cold takes faces first and gives them back last. He'd asked after her for a year at every ranch within 200 miles. Nobody claimed her. Eventually, he'd stopped asking and folded the memory away the way you fold away a coat too painful to wear and too important to give away, and gotten on with the business of living until a woman stepped off a train in Miller's Gulch, claiming to be the wrong bride entirely. The recognition, when it came, was almost nothing at all. That's usually how the real ones arrive. 9 days before the hearing, mending a torn saddle blanket by lamplight on the porch, Hallie Rourke ran a needle through canvas in a small, quick pattern she'd sewn 1,000 times without thinking about it. A line of stitches shaped, if you looked close, like a row of small running birds. Caleb, sitting across the porch with the lawyer's papers forgotten in his lap, went very still. "Where'd you learn that stitch?" he said, in a voice that had changed register entirely. "My mother's," Hallie said, not looking up. "She sewed that pattern into everything. Saddle blankets, coats, my brother's shirts when they tore. Said a plain patch was an insult to good canvas." She glanced up, caught his face, and stopped. "Caleb, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said slowly. "I think something might finally be right, and I don't quite trust it yet. Winter of '82, the Bozeman Trail north of the Forks, the worst storm anybody on that drive ever saw. Does any of that mean something to you?" Hallie's hands went still on the needle. "There was a rider," she said, quiet now, the whole shape of her attention changing. "Half frozen, alone. I never got his name, didn't have time to ask it, and didn't much think I'd see him again to need it. I gave him my coat, the old canvas one, and walked him into a line shack and left before light because I had cattle scattered from here to Sunday. That coat had my mother's stitching on the shoulder." "I still have it," Caleb said. "I never could give it away. It's folded in a trunk in the house this very minute. Mark Twain, writing about those same wide territories, once said that truth is stranger than fiction, because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities and truth is under no such obligation at all." Caleb Whitfield had read that line once in a newspaper and thought it clever. Sitting on his own porch 9 days before a hearing that could cost him everything, looking at the woman who'd once kept him alive in a storm and then walked out of his life before dawn without a name, he understood it finally as something closer to Scripture. "You saved my life and never told me your name," he said. "And 3 years later, I met you again on a train platform, and you told me before anything else that I'd bought the wrong bride." He almost laughed, and it came out closer to something else. "Hallie Rourke, I don't think you've ever once in your life been the wrong anything. The hearing on the 21st lasted 11 minutes, which is 11 minutes longer than it needed to, because Judge Hargrove, a plain and unsentimental man by every account, was moved despite himself. Silas Whitfield's lawyer laid out the timeline exactly as filed: a missing bride, a stranger off a stock train, a convenient marriage assembled inside a deadline. It was a tidy story, and it fell apart the moment Caleb Whitfield stood up, uninvited, and told the judge about a blizzard in 1882 and a coat with a mother's stitching folded in a trunk for 3 years, and asked the court plainly whether a marriage built on a debt 3 winters old, and a rescue that asked for nothing in return, sounded like fraud to him, or sounded like the single most genuine thing either party involved had ever done. Judge Hargrove asked Hallie Rourke one question only: did she love this man, separate from any ranch, any deadline, any cousin's ambitions? "I loved the shape of him before I ever learned his name," Hallie said. "The ranch is just where I finally caught up to it." The petition was dismissed. Silas Whitfield left the courthouse considerably poorer in prospects than he'd entered it, and sold his eventual much-reduced settlement to a cattle syndicate 2 years later, for far less than the railroad would once have paid, which those who knew him considered a fitting enough arithmetic. They married on the morning of the 23rd, Caleb's 30th birthday, in the yard beside the Anchor, with the 4 hands standing witness, and a travelling preacher who asked no questions he didn't already know good answers to. Hallie wore her own canvas riding skirt, patched at the knee with a small running bird pattern, because a woman doesn't stop being who she is just because she's getting married. She'd saved her groom in a blizzard only for the marriage to finally arrive at the place the rescue had happened all along. The old coat still hangs in the hallway at the Anchor, shoulder mended and all. Neither one of them has ever seen a reason to put it away. If you enjoyed this journey, there are more stories waiting, complete from first step to last, right here on this channel. Come on, stay a while longer. The fire's not going out.